And it's showtime for Tuesday Explorer. Good morning and good afternoon and welcome. I'm Trudy Murata, volunteer community ambassador with AARP here in Northern Virginia. And from our earliest beginnings, AARP has championed lifelong learning, and that's why AARP Virginia is thrilled to bring you our 5th year of Tuesday Explorers, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of April and probably into May at 3 o'clock East Coast time for all of our curious explorers. For more than 60 years, AARP has been a wise friend and a fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. AARP has earned this reputation as a wise friend and fierce defender through trusted information, tools, and advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans to empower them to choose how they live as they age. And by promising to act as this wise friend and fierce defender, AARP is helping people who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. As this wise friend in your corner, AARP helps you protect yourself and your loved ones from fraud through our Fraud Watch Network program. Get healthy and stay healthy, care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun, like what we do and what I do every Tuesday with our Tuesday Explorer program. So now let me turn the program over to my AARP colleague and volunteer, Lynn O'Connor, to introduce our speaker for today. Lynn, it's all yours.
Thank you, Trudy. Well, I'm thrilled to introduce today Joan Cummins. She's the Associate Director for Learning Initiatives at President Lincoln's Cottage, a historic house and museum in Washington, D.C., where she supports public-facing programming for students, teachers, and learners of all ages. Joan works closely with participants in their Students Opposing Slavery program, which is for young abolitionists working to combat human trafficking. And she produces and co-hosts their award-winning podcast called Q Abe, which delves into real visitor questions and the surprising facets of their answers. They hold a master's degree from American University. And I'll turn it over to you now, Joan.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be speaking with you today and really excited that there are folks from all over the country joining us. As Lynn said, I work at President Lincoln's Cottage, which is a historic house in Washington, D.C. I am curious to hear from y'all as we are getting started. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Abraham Lincoln? What are some things that come up for you? I'm gonna toggle my video real quick. I'll be right back.
I can get those for you. Freeing the slaves, the Gettysburg Address, emancipation, honesty, very kind,
very tall
man. We got very tall in there.
Yeah, he's still the tallest person ever to be president, which is pretty fun.
And his top
and yeah, I'm seeing sort of like some physical attributes of Lincoln, some sort of character attributes, and also some like landmark actions, Gettysburg Address, his work to end slavery. Gwendolyn says, how tall was he? He was 6'4", which is tall in 2025 and would have been even taller, relatively speaking, in the 1860s. Most adult men were about 5'6", 5'7", so he really towered over everybody else. What we interpret here at President Lincoln's Cottage is the 3 summers that Lincoln and his family spent living here at this historic house. While he was the president, he of course lived in the White House, as many presidents do, but during the summers of 1862, 63, and 64, he and his family moved all their stuff up here to this cottage at the top of the hill in Washington, D.C., for a couple of reasons. First of all, as some of you already know, it's pretty unpleasant here in the summer, sticky, hot, humid. I imagine even more so in a time without air conditioning. And the cottage is positioned in such a way that it catches the breeze, and the breeze comes through the windows of the house and really makes for a more comfortable physical experience. The family was also trying to escape the Potomac River, which Mrs. Lincoln blamed for the death of their middle son, Willie. Willie was 11 when he died in the White House in February of 1862 of what was probably typhoid fever. He and his younger brother, Tad, both got sick, but only Tad recovered. And just a few months later, the family came out to the cottage for the first time. What Mrs. Lincoln said about it is, when we are in sorrow, quiet is very necessary to us. So they were looking for some physical comfort, but also, I would say, emotional comfort. And then last, but very much not least, Abraham Lincoln had, of course, many complicated challenges facing him as the president, and he was looking for a place to think about complicated things. So that's one of the things that he used this place for, and we still talk about ourselves here at the cottage as a home for brave ideas. This is a picture of how the cottage looks today. And you can see in the background the castle-shaped building, which is part of the Armed Forces Retirement Home as well. I'm going to move on and show y'all a mural that we commissioned to illustrate some of Lincoln's experience while he was out here in the cottage. And I would love to hear what you see in the mural that you are noticing or have questions about. I will give you a heads up that it is a composite image. So if you see Lincoln in there twice, don't worry about it too much. He is, in fact, in there twice, both in the on the horse in the center of the image and over to the left-hand side with his family.
So they're seeing a tent. They're seeing a cottage that looks more like a mansion.
Yes. So
Sundial.
let me put the cottage is this building with the reddish roof here in the middle, and it was constructed for a banker named George Riggs. So if you are at all close to the DC area, there's a longtime bank here called Riggs Bank. That's him. He started that. He was a banker and a land speculator in the DC area. So this is his idea of what size a cottage comes in. And then he sold the house and all the land around it to the government as they were starting a retirement home for veterans. So I see that Patricia has found the wounded veteran in the center of the image. He's meant to represent the folks who would have been living on the grounds with the Lincolns. And it's the retirement home that invited the Lincolns to stay at the cottage. The family never bought the house. They were guests the whole time they were living here. As you can see, there's the castle-shaped building as well that I pointed out in the contemporary image. It's still here today. And on the left-hand side, there is another one of the historic buildings that were here in the 1860s. It was used as quarters for administrators of the retirement home. I'm also seeing a question from Kathleen about whether it's near the National Cathedral. I would say not really, Kathleen. We are on the other side of Rock Creek Park from the National Cathedral, much closer to Catholic University and the Basilica, if you know where that is. All right, y'all have pointed out a ton of things here in the image, and I will sort of tell you a little bit more about all the ones y'all have pulled up. There is a cemetery in the background that is also still here in the present. It is called the First National Cemetery, and it was in active use while Lincoln and his family were living in the cottage. It's a couple hundred yards from their front door, and it was used to bury soldiers who had fought in battles near the city and had come up to hospitals in Washington, D.C., and then had died. So 30 to 40 soldiers were buried in that cemetery every week while Lincoln was living here at the cottage. And it actually filled up entirely over the course of the Civil War, which is part of why they looked for a new site, which would become Arlington Cemetery. So if you ever visit the cottage today, which you can do every day of the week, the cemetery is still there, and it looks just like you might think Arlington would look today with the rows of white headstones. And again, it was just a couple hundred yards from the Lincoln's front door. So they came out here for a little bit of respite, but I would not describe it as them having been on vacation. On a lighter note, the goat in the foreground of the image is meant to represent Nanny, who was Tad Lincoln's pet and was allowed inside the house, which is going to be a thumbs down from me. But my impression is that Tad, as the youngest Lincoln and the one who had survived typhoid, was really able to do more or less whatever he wanted. I think you're right, Ruth, that the cemetery would be another reminder to Lincoln of the cost of his decisions. He's pictured there on the left with his family. Mrs. Lincoln, of course, is in the pink with the flower crown, and then Tad is the young boy standing in front of them. He was not, in fact, in the army, but he did want to be a soldier when he grew up. So the soldiers who were camped on the grounds, which you can see on either side of this mural image, both in the tents on the left and with the drums on the right, those are the Bucktail soldiers. They were from northwestern Pennsylvania, and they had been assigned to the site to guard the president and his family. So they were camped out on the lawn in front of the cottage. Y'all can decide how you would feel about having soldiers living in your backyard, but Tad was very excited. They gave him his own uniform. They gave him the rank of third lieutenant, which is not real. And one soldier wrote home to his mom that he had been invited up onto the porch to play checkers with Abraham Lincoln and had lost spectacularly to the president. So the soldiers were very much part of the family's life while they were living out here at the cottage. I see some comments about security and sort of accessibility for the president. Many folks are surprised at how accessible Lincoln was. The White House at that time was open to the public. So if you had a question for the president or wanted a government job, you could come and line up and ask. And then the Bucktail soldiers were detailed to guard where the president was living, not from the public, but from Confederate soldiers. So their job was not to control access to the president. It was to keep the enemy from getting to him. Later in the war, Lincoln also had a cavalry escort who would ride back and forth with him from the cottage to the White House when he was commuting to work. So those folks were first from New York and then later from Ohio. My understanding is that they thought their job was kind of boring on a day-to-day basis, but then later realized just how important their presence had been, of course, after the president was killed. Laura is asking about why they're called bucktail soldiers. They would stick deer tails into the brim of their hat. You can see the man back here near the tent doing that, and also this person carrying the flag. So that was just kind of like a nickname for them. They were actually a regiment from Pennsylvania. And like I said, they were here on the grounds with the family. The other thing I want to point out, which is very small, but still important, is this person in the green dress here in the background. Her name was Mary Williams, and she was working as the cook with the Lincoln family while they were here at the cottage. We don't know whether she was free or enslaved while she was working here, but we do know that William Slade, who was another African-American worker who had a position as Lincoln's valet, was free for the entirety of his life. And they were folks that were around the Lincolns while they were here. So am I going to say to you that any one of these things you are seeing in front of you is the thing that changed Lincoln's mind about anything? Of course not. But I do think it's important to understand what the circumstances were that were around him while he was at the cottage, because he was making landmark decisions like the Emancipation Proclamation and he was here when the Battle of Gettysburg happened. So it really helps you understand his experience in much more depth. I'm seeing a couple of other questions that I'm just going to address real quick before we move on. Jan has a question about how many sons the Lincolns lost. You are correct on both counts, Jan. The Lincolns lost 2 sons before Abraham was killed, and then 1 afterward. So it's only Robert, who was the eldest of their 4 boys, who survived to adulthood. I'm also seeing a bunch of questions about assassination, which if you don't mind, I'm going to hang on to towards the end of the conversation because we have a lot of things that he did while he was alive I would love to talk about before we talk about the end of his life. LJ is also asking about the person, the tiny guy running in the background. He is chasing an even harder to see peacock, which was they were on the grounds while the Lincolns were out here. And we have stories of Lincoln and Edwin Stanton trying to get the peacocks out of the place that they were where they were not supposed to be. So that's also part of their, like a very human part of their experience, right? Robert Lincoln had children, but not grandchildren, Ishi. So there are no longer any Lincoln descendants of Abraham Lincoln. All right, any further questions about the mural or the things that you're seeing here? It is on display in the visitor center at the cottage. Again, we're open every day of the week here in Washington, D.C. We have tickets are available on our website, which is lincolncottage.org. They're $15, and then there's a couple of other discounts involved. And there are also directions on our website about where to find us if you would like to visit. We are about 3 miles from downtown. Again, the Lincolns were out here at the cottage looking for a little bit of an escape from the downtown experience. All righty. Da, da, da. Okay, I think that's all the questions I've got about, oh, when was the mural painted? It was painted in time for our opening to the public in 2008. So the cottage has been on the site since 1842, but it was not open to the public as a museum until 2008, which means we are relatively young as a museum, even though we are very old as a historic site, right? Here we are. We're gonna move forward a little bit. Oh, Lisa, I don't believe so. Lisa is asking whether there is a younger version of Lincoln in the mural. And I would say my guess would be no, because the ask of the artist was to envision Lincoln's experience at the cottage, where he did not come until he was a president and an adult. Who lived in the house after the Lincolns? Again, before the Lincolns had been there, it belonged to the retirement home. So after the Lincolns left, the retirement home continued to use it for whatever they needed a building for. We do think that Hayes and Arthur are other presidents who were invited to come stay there, but it was also a dormitory for women when women were first admitted to the retirement home. It was an office building. It had a bar called the Lincoln Lounge in it for a while. So really, again, whatever the residents needed that building for is what it was used for after that. And we owe it to them that it was preserved in as good condition as it is, because it didn't sit empty and fall apart. People were using the building for nearly all of its life. And that's part of why we can still see it today. We're very lucky. The walls, floors, fireplaces, windows, and doors are almost entirely original. So if you come see us, you will be inside the space that Abraham Lincoln was in. I want to tell you a little more about the work that Lincoln did here at the cottage, the biggest and most complicated idea that he was working on, which was the Emancipation Proclamation. This is an image of the upstairs bedroom here at the cottage, where we believe Lincoln would have slept, or I should say not slept, because he was often awake at night, pacing back and forth in the room. He would write his ideas down on little pieces of paper, and William Slade, his valet, would collect them for him and put them into his desk. We're confident about the positioning of the desk because it sat in this spot until the 1920s, when Mrs. Hoover had it moved to the cottage. Had it moved to the White House, which is where it is today. So they gave us very special permission to make a copy for the cottage. And looking out these windows that you're looking at right now, Lincoln would have had a view of the Capitol building and downtown. So the dome of the Capitol was not complete when Lincoln first came out here in 1862. It was still under construction. And I think it really serves as a symbol of the country and our government more or less being under construction at the time as well. So Lincoln would have had a reminder of that facing south, which is which way we're looking now. And then the cemetery would have been, in his view, facing to the north of the house. Over the summer of 1862, Lincoln's thinking about what to do about slavery changed. Early on, he thought emancipation should be compensated, which means that enslavers would get paid by the government in exchange for freeing the people they had enslaved. What do y'all think about that idea? I'm curious about your thoughts from here in 2025. Again, compensated emancipation is the idea that enslavers would be paid by the government in exchange for freeing the people they had enslaved. Okay, I'm seeing a couple different things come in. I'm seeing sort of a no way, definitely not, and maybe a couple of like, how else were they going to do it? Or maybe they should have, this is a great point. I see a couple folks making that this was not a conversation about compensating the enslaved people for the work that they had been doing. It was a conversation about compensating the enslavers for the loss of their property. I think I don't think it aligns with many folks' principles here in 2025, but as he was living in the cottage in the summer of 1862, Lincoln was looking for things that he, as the president, was legally allowed to do about the problem. And that changed over time and got increasingly complicated from there. He tried it in Washington, D.C., where the cottage is located. The federal government at that time had direct jurisdiction over the city, and they implemented compensated emancipation in April of 1862. At that time, if you had stayed loyal to the Union, you got $300 for every person you had enslaved, and D.C. became free territory at that time. It was surrounded, of course, by Maryland and Virginia, which were both slave states. And so many people came to Washington, D.C. to escape slavery because they knew they could stay free if they got here. Kathleen, I think this is an interesting point. Would compensated emancipation have avoided the Civil War? It's hard to tell because it was on the table for the Lincoln administration after the war had already started. So there was no averting the war by the time 1862 happened. There had already been multiple, almost an entire year's worth of battles. Lincoln also offered compensation to the border states, which are the Union states that still held slavery. They're here in yellow on the map. I know that we have folks from all over the country here today, which is really exciting. The states that are in green are states that had ended slavery before the Civil War. To be super clear, these are not states that never had slavery. They are states that had ended slavery before the war. And the states that are in pink are states that had seceded and tried to form the Confederacy. They were a territory where people were enslaved. And the yellow states are the states that did not leave, but still had slavery. I'm just seeing a lot of notes coming in the chat, and I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Jan has a question about whether anyone got paid for their work at the end of their term of enslavement. And the answer is yes, sometimes on an individual basis, super depending on the circumstances. It is not something that happened on a systemic basis. And it was much more often the other way around, that either the enslaver was compensated by the government or that the enslaved person was paying their enslaver in order to be free. So I'm sure y'all have thought already about what would happen if the border states decided they wanted to join the Confederacy. After all, what kind of position would that have put Lincoln in? A very dicey one. At one point during the war, he was asked whether he thought God was on his side, and he said, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." So that's a little bit of a dad joke, but he could not afford for any of these border state areas to switch sides and join the Confederacy based on a decision he had made about slavery. So when he offered them compensated emancipation and they said no, he had to move on to another solution. And that's where the Emancipation Proclamation comes into the picture. Lincoln worked on this idea while he was living at the cottage, pacing back and forth in his bedroom here, reading in the library, commuting back and forth to the White House, talking to the people around him. And in July of 1862, he showed it to his cabinet as a draft. It was kind of an offer and kind of a challenge. The initial draft of the proclamation said to the Confederate States, you have 100 days to peacefully come back and rejoin the country. If you come back, you can keep all the people you've enslaved. Everything will be the same as it was before. If you don't come back, the enslaved people will become free. So Lincoln showed this to his cabinet and they said, well, I think that'll work, but you better be able to back it up. So they waited until they had a Union military victory in September to issue this 100-day challenge/offer. Then they waited 100 days and nobody took Lincoln up on it. So the full proclamation took effect in January when that 100-day deadline expired. I'm going to show you one of the sort of like the crunchiest clause of it here. It says, on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. So it's very chunky language. I'm always reminded on reading this that Lincoln was a very meticulous lawyer, but I'm wondering if any of y'all can see in this passage where the proclamation applied. What areas of the United States was this intended to free people in? Yeah, it was only applying to these pink Confederate states. It was not applying to the yellow border states, which were still considered part of the Union at the time. I saw a question also, I'm sorry, I've lost your name, but I saw a question about territories. And the question of slavery in the territories is one of the questions that divided the country on the way to the Civil War. At the time, the federal government had direct jurisdiction over the territories. If you want to look up the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that is an example of a different plan for how we would decide whether this territories had slavery that caused a lot of bloodshed. Highly recommend if you would like to know more about that. Susan, great point also. We have this as the sort of the first page of the proclamation. It says, like, remember in September, I told you this was going to happen. Now it's going to happen. And then the whole second page is a list of places where the proclamation applied or didn't apply. Some of the counties in New Orleans, around New Orleans in Louisiana, people stayed enslaved there because that territory had already been captured by the Union, and therefore those enslaved people were enslaved by loyal citizens and stayed enslaved there. So there's a list of specific parishes around New Orleans in the proclamation where people were going to stay enslaved. That's a ton of information about the proclamation, sort of all at once. What questions do y'all have about the proclamation or about how it worked, sort of on the ground? I know a lot of folks have sort of got the elementary school version, which is that Lincoln ended slavery, and it's way more complicated than that, which is so exciting.
And we're seeing frustrating and confusing, I would think, both for the enslaved as well as the owners.
I would say for a lot of folks, yes. There were folks in the North who were like, finally, we are doing something about slavery. There were folks in the North who were like, well, but what about Maryland and Kentucky? Why are you leaving some people enslaved? And there were folks in the South who were very upset about the proclamation, did not believe that Lincoln was their president and had no right to do this. There were, of course, also folks across the South who rejoiced at the fact that this might mean freedom for themselves and their families. We also have some questions showing up in the chat about how people found out about the proclamation. There was not nationwide radio at the time, but there were, telegraph lines headed all over the place. It was in the newspapers, it was part of dinner table conversations, and then enslaved people had really strong established networks of communication among enslaved communities where people found out about the proclamation sort of over time going that way. If you've ever heard the phrase "heard it through the grapevine," that's what that is referencing, is those networks of communication that were not written communication. Let me double check. Okay, we answered the question about the telegraph. Patricia has a question. If the New Orleans area enslaved people ran away to free territory, would they be returned? Technically, they would supposed to have been returned. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is way before the war, had said that not only were enslaved people who escaped to free territory not free, the people around them in the free territory were supposed to help return them to enslavement. So if somebody escaped slavery in Virginia and made it to Boston, the people in Boston were supposed to help capture and return that person to enslavement. There were riots all over the North about specific instances of this. There were people who were not at all interested in doing that. I think it's a really interesting example, counter to the argument that the Civil War was based around sort of states' rights to continue to enslave people, because the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it is an example of the slave states exercising federal level power when it was in their interests. So I don't know of any specific examples, Patricia, but technically they would have supposed to have been returned to slavery. Let me double check here. Great. Was Lincoln the only president that cared about slavery? I don't think so. I know that John Quincy Adams was a very interested in anti-slavery measures, but when he was president, the question was not, will we end slavery in the United States? It was, will we end the international slave trade? So again, I think there's complications to that answer about like which piece of the issue people were attacking over time. Joyce has a question about what was the real reason Lincoln wanted to free the slaves. And I want to applaud you, Joyce. Everybody has this question. For me, I don't think the motivations of keeping the country together and ending slavery being the right thing to do, sort of the moral component of it, are separable from each other. Lincoln was getting them both when he took this action. And the other thing the proclamation did was it allowed Black men to join the Union Army. So he also got more than 200,000 soldiers out of the action. I see some folks making connections to contemporary actions. I think that's a great connection to make because the proclamation did not ever go up for a vote. If it had happened today, we would call it an executive order, which are very exciting in a president you agree with and very scary in a president you don't agree with. So there were folks who felt both ways about Lincoln and folks who were concerned about the president taking unilateral action like this without going through Congress. Okay. Let me see. I'm also seeing some questions about the, let me answer this one more question from Jay about Lincoln's journey on this issue. When Lincoln ran for president, he was campaigning on intending to stop slavery from spreading to the territories. He was not at that time proposing to end slavery in places where it was already happening. Here in the middle of his presidency, he was issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed people in some places but not others. And then by the end of his presidency, he was advocating for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which made slavery illegal across the United States. It also made it a lot harder for a subsequent president to issue another executive order that would undo the proclamation. That's as much work as Lincoln was able to do on the issue. The 13th Amendment made it through Congress in January of 1865. Lincoln, of course, was killed in April, and the amendment was ratified and added to the Constitution in December. So Lincoln did not get to see the results of his work. And then I'm also seeing a bunch of questions about the aftermath of the proclamation. Like, when did people hear about it? What happened next? Would they have been citizens? Would they have been counted as full citizens for purposes of congressional representation rather than the 3/5 that they were written into as enslaved people in the Constitution? And those were all questions that had to be answered after Lincoln had died. So the 13th Amendment came through in December of 1865. It's almost 3 full years after the issuing of the proclamation. Then there was the 14th Amendment, which is the foundation of citizenship to this day in the United States. It says that anyone who was born here is an American. It also provides for equal protection under the law and a couple of other things, which you should definitely ask a constitutional scholar about if you have time. But the 14th Amendment does not come through until later in the 1860s. And then the 15th Amendment, which granted African-American men the right to vote, didn't come through until the 1870s. So this all seems like it happened sort of 1, 2, 3 to us, but for the people living it, I think it must have felt like a long time, right? And I think it's important to remember that when people said, like, we want freedom, or we want freedom to happen, what they meant by that word freedom was different for everybody. Some people assumed it just meant literal legal freedom. Other people assumed that it meant resources and your own land and citizenship, or the right to vote, or the right to education, all different kinds of things. And so the population was really all still figuring out what exactly that meant in the aftermath of the Civil War, which I think was just as chaotic as you might imagine it to have been.
Joan, we've lost your shared screen.
Yes, I closed it because
Oh,
I still had the map up, and I thought maybe people were tired of looking at the map, but I'm happy to bring it back if folks would like to see it.
Okay, yeah, let's get back to the presentation, because I know you've got pictures of the inside of the cottage, and I want to make sure that we don't run out of time for the presentation itself, because those pictures are excellent.
For sure. So this is a photo of the upstairs bedroom at the cottage that Lincoln was using while he was living here. And he would pace back and forth along the floor. You can also see this image here of the outside of the cottage, how it looks today. This is the front door. So when you come on a tour, you will be coming through the front door and exploring the rooms of the house from there. Cindy has a question about, once people were free, how did they survive with no work or homes? And I think you're right, Cindy. Many other people had the same question. They were not given many, if any, institutional resources to support their growth from there. So people made themselves lives starting from almost nothing. They built themselves new houses that were further away from the big house where they had been enslaved. They did their best to set up work arrangements for themselves. They built themselves schools. They put ads in the newspaper trying to track down their family members they had been separated from. One example that makes it really clear to me is that there had been women who were doing laundry while they were enslaved. And then, of course, after they were free, after the war, the laundry still needed to be done. But now these women would take the laundry back to their own house, and they would do it on their own schedule with their children and their families around them, which is simultaneously a small difference and not a small difference at all. Gwendolyn, if you're looking for the front door, it's brown here in the smallest little peak of the roof here at the cottage. The cottage is one of the earliest examples of Gothic revival architecture in the United States. So that's why it sort of has a gingerbread house look to it. Yeah, I think you're right. I'm showing your name as C. Levy, that this task would have been nearly insurmountable. And I think the resilience and determination of the people who were faced with it is one of the most inspiring things about American history, frankly. All right. So Lincoln lived here in the cottage in the summer of 1862. He came up with the proclamation. We've talked about all of those details. He came back for the summer of 1863 when the battle at Gettysburg happened, and he came back for the summer of 1864 when he was running for re-election. So there were a lot of folks who were telling him we need to calm down about the slavery thing, you need to say less of it so that you can win. But Lincoln recommitted, and in 13th Amendment, as 13th Amendment, it prohibits slavery in the United States unless you have been convicted of a crime. And this exception clause was exploited by states under their Jim Crow administrations to force Black people to labor under crimes that weren't really crimes. They were sort of like being outside after dark. Christopher, can you clarify your question? I'm seeing, do you think Lincoln would have done more slavery if he had lived? Can you say more about that? Do you mean, would Lincoln have done more about slavery? Lots of folks have that question too. And I don't know. Everybody would love to know the answer. I would say that we know a small amount about Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction because they tried it with some of those counties in Louisiana. But we don't know whether and the other thing we know about it is that he was proposing that Black men who had fought in the US Army would be granted the right to vote. So those are the two tidbits we have about his policy going forward from there. And you can extrapolate from there. The commitment to Black soldiers being able to vote is the thing that pushed Booth to assassinate Lincoln. Booth was in the audience when Lincoln made that speech, and Booth turned to the person next to him and said, "That means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever make." All righty. Does anyone have other questions about the things we've been talking about today? Oh, a question about Mrs. Lincoln. The dining room is very small, Miriam. It fits a table that would seat maybe 6 or 8 people. And we don't have a sense that Mrs. Lincoln entertained sort of state dinners or anything up at the cottage. The Lincolns were using this as their home, but anything that was sort of an official government thing that would have been happening down at the White House. So if you've seen images of the Lincoln China or any of the engravings of them hosting events, those are intended to happen at the White House. Laura is curious about whether there was a nursery, and that is a great question to which we do not know the answer. We know that the rooms on the second floor of the cottage, including this one, were bedrooms, but we don't know to whom they belonged. We're in a really unique place as a historic house because the Lincolns, when they left, this house didn't stay with the Lincoln family and it didn't keep their stuff. They took all their stuff back to the White House with them every fall when they left. So if we were to fill the rooms up with furniture, we would be mostly guessing about what the Lincolns had here. I hear it's 19 wagons full of stuff, which seems like a lot of stuff to me. Can you repeat what Booth said? Booth said in that audience, that means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever make. Let me see what I have about other I see that folks are very interested in images of the interior. I'm worried they'll be disappointing for y'all, but I will see what I can
I'm
pull
gonna
up on
move
my
you
end.
forward, Joan, because I'm afraid I know
Okay.
you've got some time restraints and I want to make sure
Mm-hmm.
we get through all of this. So let's hold off on the rest of the questions until we get to the end, and we will get to as many as we possibly can, and I'll help you find them.
Sure. So if you give me just a moment, Trudy, I'm going to look for my other photos of the house as my presentation, excuse me, was primarily about the proclamation. Um, Patricia, we do not know about the kitchen. There's a room in the basement that would have been a possibility, but we also think it's possible that folks would have been cooking outside, especially in the summer. I can imagine that it would have been very unpleasant to have a fire going inside the house. We do know that Mary Williams, who was the cook, we do know that she was the cook. We don't know very much else about her and the rest of her life. There was actually some confusion in the initial research about the house, where she was confused with a different person who was also called Aunt Mary. But that person was Mary Dines, and here we go. She was not at the cottage at all, as far as we know. So just a couple of photos that I have access to since folks are interested. This is a photo of the front foyer. To the left over here is the entrance to the front door, and these are the steps that go up to the second floor. The flooring here is painted and waxed canvas. So it looks like linoleum, but it's actually something period that would have been similar. This is what the library looks like at the cottage. We know there would have been bookshelves in Lincoln's time. You can kind of see over here on the left-hand side the lines of where they would have been just above this lamp. But we don't know a lot about what exactly the room would have looked like because, again, the Lincolns moved all their stuff back to the White House every summer. Susan is talking about the picture of Robert Lincoln at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial, who was present. The other thing that's interesting to me about that dedication ceremony is that segregated audience. On the school program, they make their own top hat to keep their brave ideas in, so that's pretty incredible. I highly recommend. This is a photo of a school group in the living room, the drawing room, we might say, of the cottage. So this folding door here in the back opens into the library. That's our life-size statue of Lincoln. It's out front of the cottage. We commissioned it for his 200th birthday in 2009. And it is life-size. So if you are curious how it would feel to stand next to Lincoln, you can come and check it out. Again, he's the tallest person ever to be president at 6'4". And then also there's a top hat after that. This is the parlor of the cottage. Again, where we have included some things to suggest what the furniture might have been. But we don't have any interior photos of the house at all from when the Lincolns were here. We do have, oh yes, Ruth is noticing the window here. This is called a jib door. You can see there's two here in the parlor, but they're all along the south side of the house. And that's one of the reasons the cottage was more comfortable in a sticky DC summer than the White House, because it was built to deal with that summer weather experience. that's the view of the cottage that we saw from the mural. And this is an image of students in our Students Opposing Slavery program, which we mentioned briefly at the beginning. It brings kids from all over the world to the cottage to work to end contemporary slavery and human trafficking. The 13th Amendment, which we talked about earlier, is still the basis on which we prosecute human traffickers today. I hope that was helpful for folks who are curious about the interior of the cottage a little bit more. But that's what I have in terms of those photos. Did we have other questions coming through, Trudy?
We had a question, if the slaves were granted citizenship within the Emancipation.
Not within the Emancipation Proclamation at all. The only thing the proclamation says about the aftermath of slavery is that it allowed Black men to join the army and it encouraged people to labor faithfully for reasonable wages. So that seems really vague to me, frankly, but that's what it says in the proclamation itself.
And once the slaves were freed, how did they survive without work or homes?
Oh, we talked about that a little bit, but that's a great question, and they had to figure that answer out. They did not really receive any institutional support for that. So the solutions that people came up to when they were really starting from nothing are, like I said, for me, one of the most inspiring things about American history. I am seeing some questions in the chat, Trudy. Do you mind
Okay.
if I answer those
Nope.
too?
Go ahead.
Valerie wants to know why they moved the furniture. The Lincolns moved their furniture back and forth because they didn't own the house. Again, they were guests of the retirement home. So it's kind of like bringing your favorite chair to your beach house and then taking it home again with you at the end of the summer. And I also saw a question about Mrs. Lincoln's mental health. It's almost impossible to diagnose in retrospect, but one of the things I've learned about her through our work here at the cottage is that many of the things that are cited as examples of her mental illness are actually manifestations of her grief for her husband. So there are times when her son Robert would say, like, I don't know why she's so upset today. I don't know what she's making a big deal about. And it would be on the anniversary of her husband's death. And so that makes perfect sense to me that someone would be upset after her experiences losing 3 children and her husband. And I wish there had been more room for her to experience her feelings and to be more supported.
Sure. We're getting close to the top of our hour. And before I turn the program back over to Lynn O'Connell for just a moment, Joan, what triggered your passion for studying and dedicating your love of history and of Lincoln?
I knew almost nothing about Lincoln before I started working at the cottage, so that is all an occupational hazard. But I'm interested in history in the first place because I think understanding where we came from helps us understand where we are in enough depth that we can make a better plan for where we're going.
Excellent. Thank you. Lynn, are you still with us?
I am. Thank you very much. I think you win the award, Joan, for the most questions, at least of the Tuesday Explorers events that I've attended over the last few weeks in recent memory. So well done, and I'm thrilled to see this level of excitement. Now, we will continue with Tuesday Explorers in the upcoming weeks. Secret is we may even continue into May. And next week, we're going to have Afro-Latina Heritage with Kim Haas from PBS. So we hope to see each and every one of you then.
Very good. Thank you. Lynn, thank you for finding Joan and for bringing to this particular program of Tuesday Explorer with us. Joan, thank you for your time, your expertise, and your ability to juggle both the presentation and that myriad of questions that came through. Thank you so much. We do appreciate your time. So
Thanks, everybody.
of AARP Virginia, I'd like to thank our guest speaker, Joan, for sharing her valuable time and knowledge with us this afternoon. We'd love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs. So you will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to a survey. And guess what? That follow-up email will also have a link to the recording of today's program as well. Our Tuesday Explore program continues next week. We invite you to join us. Afro-Latino Heritage with Kim Haas, PBS travel host. So I hope you'll join us next week and in all the weeks to follow. There's a link to register for next week and future programs. And until next time, we invite you to stay curious, keep exploring, and come join me next Tuesday. It's been a pleasure having Joan with us today. Lynn, thank you for finding her for us. And everyone, have a great afternoon. Stay warm.